Justin Taylor with Crossway Books and have the privilege of sitting down today with Dr. John Feinberg, discussing his revised and updated edition of the classic book, Ethics for a Brave New World. Dr. Feinberg, thanks for taking a few minutes to chat today.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Well, tell us a little bit about the origin of this book. You co-authored it originally with your brother.
Yes.
You were working on it over 20 years ago.
Yes, actually, we both taught ethics together at Trinity, and we would bemoan the fact that there wasn't a textbook that would cover a large number of topics, and so you had to use 3 or 4 different ones. And at one point, my brother said, well, what do you think about writing one ourselves? And that was sort of the origin of this project, and we took it to Crossway, and they were excited about it.
So, published originally in 1993.
Yes.
And then just this year, 2010, the new edition has come out.
Yes.
So, what has changed in the last 17 to 20 years requiring a new, updated, expanded edition?
Well, it seems like just about everything. There are topics that no one was talking about when we first wrote the book, things like stem cell technology, but then topics that people were talking about, the discussions have developed tremendously. And in going to revise the book, I thought it would only involve updating bibliography, but I found that in pretty much every chapter there was something new to say. Not so much as to throw everything out that we'd said before, but many different current events had happened that needed to be reflected, and then new arguments, new discussions.
I think some people, when they look at a book of this size, I mean, it's bordering on 900 pages. It's a classic textbook, and I was telling you earlier of all the evangelical ethics texts that I have, it's the one I've turned to over the years again and again and again because it's so comprehensive and clear and well written and helpful. So,
thanks.
Personal thanks to you for that.
Thank you.
But it's not just a textbook. I mean, this is personal for you, and there's personal stories behind it, which you've been upfront about in the beginning of the various editions. Would you be willing to talk for just a minute about that and some of the stories behind it?
Sure. As I mentioned, it initially started out as an academic project, but very, very quickly the things we were writing about became evident as totally relevant to what was going on in our family life. And there were several events that had happened even by the time we had published the first edition. And between the first and the second edition, a number of other things had happened. And one of the things that happened prior to the second edition coming out is that my brother passed away in February 2004. And so obviously we weren't going to be able to co-author a revision of it.
Help us situate your perspective a little bit with regard to how you approach ethics. Some people watching who may not be as familiar with ethical discussions wouldn't immediately know what deontological ethics means or divine command theory, but
Sure.
Maybe you could give just a little bit of an overview of where you and your brother are coming from in terms of your ethical perspective.
Sure, and that's really the place to start, because what your ethical theory is going to determine what kind of arguments you think are good in favor of or against any one of these technologies or activities that we talk about in the book. A lot of people in our day hold what is known as consequentialism or teleological ethics. That's an approach that says that as long as you get the results that you're looking for, whatever those results might be, it doesn't matter how you got there. So that is an approach that says the end justifies the means. In contrast, a non-consequentialist or deontological approach to ethics says something other than the results of actions determine whether an action is right or wrong, morally speaking. And the particular theory that we hold says that, well, that something that makes an action right or wrong is that God has revealed that this is what our duty is. And any theory that is grounded in God's commands is referred to as a divine command theory. Some of those theories have said that God could command anything whatsoever, and he could totally change the rules at any time. The theory that we hold is one that is a more moderate one. It does not allow God to change the rules to the exact opposite, because it says that God's ethical rules are ultimately grounded in his nature as God. And for example, God is a God of truth. He only speaks the truth, and so he expects us to tell the truth. He's a God of love, and committing murder, stealing, things like that are not acts of love, so he doesn't do that, and he commands us not to do those sorts of things. So it's rooted in Scripture. And if someone says, well, why should anybody believe a scriptural approach to ethics, what they're actually doing is pushing you to do a defense of the worldview out of which your ethical theory arises. And I think a lot of people hear that and they think, oh, well, that's a horrible burden for a Christian to have to bear. But what we need to see is the exact same requirement falls upon people who don't hold a biblically based ethical approach. Everybody's ethical theory stems from some worldview, and they can be and should be challenged to defend the worldview that generates their ethical theory.
So there's some, within evangelicalism or within a divine command theory, a Christian ethic, there are some things that are easier than others. Do not murder, do not torture an innocent human being for pleasure. There would be very little disagreement about that. But how do you approach something? You mentioned stem cell research earlier. It's going to be very difficult to go to the Bible and find God speaking specifically on that issue. And if you could teleport one of the biblical authors here, and you ask them that question, they wouldn't even know what you're talking about. So how do you put together divine command theory and ethical situations upon which there are not specific commands from God?
Well, let me start out by just saying that our approach in the book, and I think the approach of any ethical theory, should be to determine what your duty or your moral obligation is. And in our case, the Bible is the source of moral duties. So when we look at a given technology or a given activity, the initial question is going to be, is there a moral principle in Scripture that tells me that I can or I cannot? If there's not, and as you say, many of the things we see today could not possibly have been foreseen by the biblical authors, if there isn't something that directly addresses it, that doesn't mean that there aren't principles, moral rules that wouldn't indirectly address it. Let me give you just a simple example. Nowhere in Scripture will you find a passage that says, thou shalt not videotape a movie off TV and charge your neighbor's admission to watch it. But because there isn't any such rule like that, that doesn't mean that it's okay to do that. There are rules in Scripture clearly stated about not stealing. And when you realize that what I've just described is an act of stealing, well, then you can say the Bible, though it's written thousands of years prior to when we're living, is relevant. It does have something to say. But in terms of many of the topics in the book, you have to look for a rule that is going to indirectly relate to the topic. You aren't going to find something that directly and explicitly talks about the subject.
So that raises the issue of moral dilemmas. When you have two rules that you find in Scripture that both seem to have some bearing upon the situation, and it can be difficult at times to determine which one is higher, and do the two ever create such a dilemma that there's no good way out? Maybe you could talk a little bit about just the nature of moral dilemmas, and then how you as a Christian individual approach the decision-making process of resolving those dilemmas?
Sure. Undoubtedly, there are times, we've probably always, all of us have experienced it, where we do find ourselves in a moral dilemma. We're in a situation where two different rules seem to apply, and it becomes clear we can't obey both of them. Or perhaps it's a situation where only one rule applies, but it applies to two people. For example, there is a rule to preserve life, a moral rule not to take life, and then you get into a situation where a mother is pregnant, and let's say she's diagnosed with uterine cancer, and the doctor says, this is very aggressive, you need to start treatments right away. If you don't, you're not going to survive long range. But of course, if she starts those treatments, it's going to kill the baby. Now, there's a duty to preserve life and a duty not to take innocent life. Basically, that makes up one general rule. Obviously, in this case, you've got a moral dilemma because there's a duty to both the mother and the child, but it looks like you can't possibly save both of them. And it's at this point where I think it's very helpful to focus on a fundamental rule that you'll find in really any ethical system that you might look at. The longer version says nobody can be held morally accountable for failing to do what they couldn't do or for doing what they couldn't fail to do, which is a roundabout way of saying you can't be held morally accountable for your actions unless you're free to act. In a case such as the one we've imagined, and in a real ethical dilemma, you'll know that it's a real ethical dilemma because you won't be free to obey both rules. So which one do you obey? Well, when there are two ethical rules that conflict, the ethicist has to, and not just the ethicist, but the ordinary person, has to decide in their thinking which of those rules, valuable though they both are, has greater priority in the situation. And then it's your duty to obey the one that has greater priority. And if you do obey that, you'll obviously not be able to fulfill the other rule, but you're not guilty for failing to obey the second rule because you were not able to do so. You weren't free to do so. Now, not everybody addresses moral dilemmas in that particular way, but the approach that we've taken in the book is one called hierarchicalism. You construct a hierarchy of ethical norms, and the ones that apply in a given case, you have to make a decision as to which one has the greater priority, and then you choose that, and you're not immoral for failing to fulfill both because you couldn't fulfill both.
It's great that you've written the full book too, to just be able to, for readers to go back and explore that and think through that. And,
sure.
And again, like I mentioned earlier, these are such complex topics, really requiring everything from the Christian of engaging our minds and using our community and the best arguments and reason and revelation. But I think one of the things that you've done, and along with your brother, have made things so clear. Again, want to express the thanks for you for the clarity of the book in particular.
Well, thanks. We realized that if you have wonderful material, but it's impossible to understand, it isn't going to help anyone.
Yeah.
So basically, I think the strategy that my brother used, and it is a strategy I've used for many, many years, is to try to write the way I would preach a sermon. Now, there are going to be fewer technical words in a sermon than there will be in a book, but there might still be some technical words. You make a point to explain them, but in writing a book, you try to give it the greatest depth of thought you can muster, but you don't have to state it in a way that only somebody from another planet who studied this for several millennia could understand. You try to make it, make your comments as though you are preaching to an audience and you're explaining it as carefully as you can to them. Whether that entirely works on every page, I will leave to the reader, but that's what we intended to do.
The range of materials that you cover: abortion, euthanasia, capital punishment, human sexuality, birth control, homosexuality, genetic engineering, reproductive technologies, and several, divorce and remarriage, Christian and war, Christian secular state. You have several on genetic engineering and reproductive technologies. Can you give us a sense of what's changed in the past 20 years? What are some of the issues and dilemmas that the average Christian may not even be aware of at this stage, and how do we think through this constantly changing and developing field?
Sure. Well, one thing that has to be understood is that science is continuing to move on, and oftentimes it moves much faster than the ethicists and theologians do. And so a lot of times before theologians and ethicists can even think about some of these things, the technology and the practice is already in existence. And one of the things that we're trying to do is to share not only what is going on, but what the future might look like and how should we respond if there are certain things that eventuate. But to give you just an example, in the reproductive technologies portion, there are a number of different reproductive technologies that we talk about. Artificial insemination is one, surrogate mothering, cloning, in vitro fertilization. Now, in regard to in vitro fertilization, I think nowadays, if you hear anything about this, what you hear is how many babies are being born using this methodology in any given year. And what is clearly going on since the time we first wrote this is that this has become a much more prevalent process. And if all that you hear is the number of babies who are being born in a given year, say in the United States, you'll think, wow, this is absolutely a guarantee of a way to have a baby if we can't have one any other way. What you rarely, if ever, are told is how many eggs are taken from the mother, fertilized, and how many of them are either thrown away because the doctor thinks they wouldn't likely produce a successful pregnancy, or the couple doesn't want instant family, 4 or 5 of these, so you're going to freeze some of them. The unfortunate thing that isn't oftentimes explained is that as embryos are on ice, so to speak, over time they deteriorate. So the likelihood that if you would thaw them out and try to produce a pregnancy from them gets less and less and less likely over time. But the other thing that isn't oftentimes understood is that normally they are not going to just transfer one embryo to the uterus and think that that's how you'll get a baby. Normally, there are going to be several of these embryos because when you use 2 or 3, that's pretty much the going rate that they use now. When you use 2 or 3 of them, you increase the likelihood that one of them may attach to the uterus and produce a successful pregnancy. If you only use 1, I think it's about an 18% success rate. If you use, say, 3, it's maybe 34, 35% success rate that one of them will. But it's also the case that when you transfer multiple embryos, your intent and your hope is that not all of them will attach to the uterine wall. If they do, you're going to have instant family. But to increase the likelihood that anything is going to happen positively, you have to use multiple embryos. Well, when you think overall about the success rates, and if you read statistics on how many eggs are taken in one of these cycles and fertilized, what you realize is that there are far more of these embryos that are lost, and by lost I mean they die, than there are that produce even a pregnancy. And of course, just because you get a pregnancy doesn't mean you're going to get a live birth. There could be a miscarriage in the process. What also needs to be understood is that in American clinics, the average cost for an artificial reproductive technology cycle, that involves harvesting the eggs, fertilizing them, and then eventually transferring them. The average cost for one cycle is about $12,400. And it is much more likely that you will come away with no baby than that you will get a baby from this process. Now, when people hear in a given year there were 35,000, 51,000 babies who were born by this procedure, and that's all they hear, it's quite misleading. From a moral standpoint, if you think that a fertilized egg is a human being, a human person, then what happens to those fertilized eggs is not morally indifferent. What's interesting here is that the same kind of issue arises here that does in the abortion debate. The fact that the egg is fertilized in a petri dish as opposed to fertilized inside of a woman makes absolutely no difference to the moral status, to the DNA sequence of the embryo or anything else that's going on.
So if a young couple were to sit in your office and they were to say, we have the money and we're willing to parent all of these children if it's implanted, do you think it's morally permissible to go through with in vitro fertilization?
Yeah, personally I don't, and we've argued that the difference between the first edition and this edition is we made the case or the argument in the first edition that this procedure is too destructive of embryonic life, and if you think that an embryo is a human person in God's image, then that means you are taking innocent life and you're violating thou shalt not kill. What I think people who are at the scientific end of IVF thought would happen is that they would get way, way more proficient at this process. There would be a much higher success rate, and so everyone could use it and be very happy about it. What we were able to come up with in preparation for this edition are statistics that would not have been available and were not available when we wrote the first edition. Statistics on how many eggs are actually taken, how many are fertilized, how many are used, and there's statistics on how likely it is that you'll be successful depending on how old the mother is. The younger, the more likely that there will be success. When you look at all of those statistics, it seems to me that the argument we made in the first edition that is too wasteful of embryonic life is still the correct argument, except now I'm able to back it up with all kinds of statistics to show you how many actual lives are lost through the use of this technology.
So it's the same conclusion, it's just strengthened at this stage.
I think so. We have more raw data, if we can put it that way, to substantiate the claim that this is just too wasteful of human life.
Maybe you can say a word about the genetic engineering aspect of it. What are some of the moral responsibilities and issues at play in being able to determine what your child might be, and having an ideal and trying to minimize things that you don't want to happen?
Well, I think that first we need to realize that there's a number of different practices that fall under the rubric of genetic engineering. On the one hand, there are things like genetic counseling, genetic screening, things like manipulation of the genetic code to enhance, is the way it oftentimes is referred to enhance life. In other words, there may not be anything particularly wrong with a given life, but you think your life would be better if you had some different characteristic. And so you think, well, if I can find out that this characteristic is governed by a gene and we can change the gene, well, then I will have this different characteristic. So, for example, if you happen to be someone who is brown-haired and brown-eyed, but you think blondes have more fun and you'd like to have blonde hair and blue eyes, and you can identify, or science can identify, the genes that cover those traits. Well, there's a question about whether it would be morally acceptable to make that change. And that's not as easy a decision as you might think, because I think a lot of people would initially say, well, no, that's immoral to do that. But then, on the other hand, the same person might go out and get some hair coloring and bleach their hair blonde, go to an eye doctor and get a blue-tinted contact lens, and produce the same effects. And the question is, well, would that be morally acceptable? I think most of us would say yes. But then the question is, well, then why wouldn't it be morally acceptable to produce the same result through genetic engineering? Well, let me move on further. Some of the other things that are involved in genetic engineering are things like gene therapy. And here the intent is to locate defective genes and to correct them so as to allow a person either to avoid getting a genetic disease, or perhaps if they already have it, hopefully to cure it, or at least to tone down the symptom. So you're not talking about a homogeneous, if I can put it that way, set of technologies and practices, and moral rules that might rule out one of those would not necessarily rule out all of them.
Well, I could discuss these topics with you all day. Again, in the book you cover divorce and remarriage, homosexuality, ethics of war, and how Christians relate to the secular state. And I mean, there's just so much in this book. So thank you again for writing it, and thanks for watching this for a few minutes. Again, the book is Ethics for a Brave New World, the second updated and expanded edition just out from Crossway Books.